The blizzard struck Chicago with the kind of fury that made even seasoned Midwesterners respect winter's power. Margaret Chen pulled her cashmere coat tighter as she stepped from the corporate car into the swirling snow outside the Palmer House Hotel. The wind cut through the downtown canyon of buildings like a blade, and she could barely see the ornate entrance through the white curtain of precipitation. Inside the lobby's warmth, Maggie shook the snow from her dark hair and tried to shake off the challenging evening's board meeting. 15 years building Chen Tech Solutions from a startup in her garage to a $40 million consulting firm. And now Harrison Industries wanted to acquire it in what they called a strategic partnership, but what felt more like a corporate takeover. The hotel lobby hummed with the quiet elegance she'd grown accustomed to, crystal chandeliers casting warm light on marble floors, the soft murmur of well-dressed guests, the reassuring weight of privilege that came with platinum credit, cards and penthouse suites. But tonight, even luxury couldn't buffer the exhaustion that had settled into her bones. She was heading toward the elevator when she noticed her. A woman sat in the far corner of the lobby, tucked into an alcove near a massive potted palm. She was perhaps in her late 30s, with brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and clothes that had seen better seasons. She wasn't bothering anyone, just sitting quietly, reading a paperback novel with pages worn soft from multiple readings. Her posture spoke of someone trying to take up as little space as possible while still existing in the world. 2 hotel security guards approached the woman with the purposeful stride Maggie recognized from countless corporate dealings, polite but firm authority. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but you can't remain here," the taller guard said, his voice carrying across the marble space. "This is a private lobby for hotel guests only." The woman looked up from her book, and Maggie caught a glimpse of intelligent green, eyes that held neither defiance nor shame, just a weary acceptance that suggested this wasn't her first such encounter. "Of course," the woman said quietly, already closing her book and preparing to venture back into the storm that raged beyond the glass doors. "I understand." Something in that moment struck Maggie like lightning. Maybe it was the woman's dignity, in the face of dismissal, or the contrast between the lobby's abundance and the harsh reality waiting outside, or simply the bone-deep loneliness that Maggie had been carrying since her divorce 2 years ago, a loneliness that no amount of success seemed to fill. "Actually," Maggie heard herself saying, her heels clicking across the marble as she approached, "she's with me." The security guards turned, taking in Maggie's expensive coat and the confidence that came from years of commanding corporate boardrooms. The woman looked up, surprise flickering across her features. Miss Chen, the hotel manager Rodriguez, appeared with the practiced smile of someone who recognized valued guests. "Is everything all right?" "Everything's fine," Maggie said, extending her hand to the woman. "I'm sorry I'm late, Sarah. The board meeting ran longer than expected." The woman, Sarah, stared at Maggie's outstretched hand for a long moment, clearly trying to process this unexpected intervention. Finally, she took it, her grip firm, despite the obvious uncertainty in her eyes. "Ma'am," Rodriguez said to Maggie, "I'm afraid we have a situation. The storm has caused significant flight delays, and we're completely booked tonight. I was just about to call you. Even your usual suite is occupied by stranded passengers we had to accommodate." Maggie felt Sarah's hand start to pull away, but she held on. "What do you have available?" "Only the presidential suite, but it's quite expensive, and I assumed—" "That's fine," Maggie said. "We'll take it." Rodriguez nodded and disappeared to arrange the details. The security guards, their authority deflated by the obvious wealth and status of Maggie's intervention, melted back into the lobby's background hum. Sarah finally managed to free her hand. "Look, I don't know why you did that, but you don't need." "The storm's getting worse," Maggie interrupted, glancing toward the windows where snow continued to assault the glass. No one should be out in this. They stood in awkward silence for a moment, two women from entirely different worlds, connected by an impulsive act of kindness that neither quite understood. Ms. Chen, Rodriguez returned with key cards. The presidential suite is ready. Will you need anything else this evening? No, thank you, Maggie said, taking the cards. She handed one to Sarah, who accepted it like it might burst into flames. The elevator ride to the top floor passed in silence, heavy with unspoken questions. Maggie found herself studying Sarah's reflection in the polished brass doors. There was something familiar about her, though Maggie couldn't place it. The woman had the bearing of someone educated, someone who had once moved through professional circles before whatever circumstances had led her to seek shelter in hotel lobbies. The presidential suite was opulent even by Maggie's standards, floor to ceiling, windows offering a panoramic view of the snow-covered city, a marble bathroom, larger than most apartments, and a bedroom with a king-sized bed that seemed to mock the awkwardness of their situation. Sarah stood just inside the door, taking in the space with eyes that suggested she was calculating its value against her current circumstances. "This is beautiful," she said finally, "but I can't." "The couch looks comfortable," Maggie interrupted, loosening her coat. "I've slept in worse places during business trips." "No," Sarah's voice carried unexpected firmness. No, I can't let you do this. You don't even know me." Maggie paused in hanging up her coat, really looking at Sarah for the first time. She saw intelligence in those green eyes, and something else, a quality of attention that suggested this woman had spent her life caring for others. "You're right," Maggie said. "I don't know you, but I know what it's like to feel invisible, to be dismissed by people who think they understand your worth based on appearances." She gestured toward the suite's luxury. "This is just money. It doesn't mean anything without—" She stopped, surprised by her own honesty. "Without what?" Sarah asked quietly. Maggie met her gaze. "Without connection, without meaning something to someone." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, studying Maggie's face as if trying to read a complex document. Finally she said, "I know who you are." Maggie's stomach tightened. She'd become used to recognition in business circles, but there was something different in Sarah's tone. "I used to work at Northwestern Memorial," Sarah continued. "I was a nurse there until about 2 years ago. I remember seeing your picture in the Tribune's business section, articles about your company's success. But that's not why I recognize you." The silence stretched between them, filled with the sound of wind and snow against the windows. "I was working the night shift 3 years ago when Margaret Chen, your mother, was brought into the ER. She'd had a heart episode at home alone. We did everything we could, but by the time the paramedics got her to us..." Maggie's breath caught. She remembered that night with brutal clarity, trapped in a merger meeting that had run past midnight, her phone on silent, missing call after call from the hospital until it was too late. "She wasn't alone at the end," Sarah said softly. "I held her hand. She talked about you, how proud she was of your success, how worried she was that you worked too hard. She kept asking if you were coming, and I told her you were on your way." Tears Maggie hadn't allowed herself to shed in 3 years suddenly threatened to fall. She turned toward the windows, toward the city lights blurred by snow and grief. "She passed away before I could get there," Maggie whispered. "She left this world knowing she was loved," Sarah replied. "That's not nothing." The weight of that revelation settled between them like a bridge neither had expected to cross. Maggie turned back to face Sarah, seeing her not as a stranger in need of charity, but as someone who had been present for the most important moment she herself had missed. "The bed is yours," Maggie said, her voice thick with emotion. "I'll sleep on the floor. It's the least I can do for someone who gave my mother comfort when I couldn't." Sarah shook her head slowly. "That's not why I told you. I didn't tell you to make you feel guilty or obligated." "Then why?" Because you needed to know that your mother's last thoughts were of love, not disappointment. That matters more than any business deal or corporate success. They stood facing each other across the opulent room, two women carrying different kinds of pain, different kinds of loss. Outside, the blizzard continued to rage, but inside something had shifted, a crack in the walls both women had built around their hearts. The choice hung in the air between them like a question waiting to be answered. Maggie could maintain her carefully constructed barriers, treat this as a simple transaction of privilege, helping the less fortunate. Or she could allow this moment, this unexpected connection to someone who had witnessed her deepest loss, to mean something more. "I'll take the couch," Maggie said finally, "but only if you tell me how you went from being a nurse at one of the city's best hospitals to—" She gestured gently toward Sarah's circumstances. Sarah's expression hardened slightly. "To seeking shelter in hotel lobbies? To needing a safe place during blizzards," Maggie corrected gently. For a moment, Sarah looked like she might deflect or leave entirely. Then something in her posture softened, perhaps recognizing in Maggie's question not judgment, but genuine curiosity, maybe even concern. "It's a long story," Sarah said. "We have all night," Maggie replied, settling onto the suite's expensive couch, "and I suspect neither of us was planning to sleep much anyway." Outside, Chicago disappeared under a blanket of white, and in the warm sanctuary of the presidential suite, two women began to share the stories that had brought them to this unexpected moment of connection. The expensive coffee maker in the suite's kitchenette gurgled to life as dawn crept across Chicago's snow-covered skyline. Neither woman had slept much. They'd spent the night in conversation that meandered through the territory of loss, resilience, and the strange ways life could strip away everything you thought defined you. Maggie had learned that Sarah's challenges began with another nurse's mistake, a medication error during a chaotic night shift that resulted in a patient's serious complications. Sarah, covering for an overworked colleague she considered a friend, had taken responsibility. The legal proceedings that followed revealed Sarah's own battle with cancer, the medical bills that had already begun eating away at her savings, the insurance company's reluctance to cover experimental treatments that might have saved not just her career, but her life. The settlement to avoid further legal complications had taken everything: her home, her savings, her nursing license. The cancer had gone into remission, but the financial devastation proved terminal to the life she'd built. "The irony," Sarah had said somewhere around 3 a.m., cradling a cup of tea from the suite's well-stocked minibar, "is that I got into nursing to help people. In the end, trying to help someone cost me everything I had." Now, as morning light filled the suite, Maggie found herself reluctant to return to the world beyond these walls, a world where her company faced acquisition and where Sarah would have to resume the challenging work of survival on the streets. Her phone buzzed insistently on the marble countertop. A text from her assistant. "Emergency board meeting moved to 9 a.m. Harrison's lawyers are here early. This doesn't look positive." "Work calling?" Sarah asked, emerging from the bedroom, looking more rested than she had any right to after sleeping. "In a strange place." "Unfortunately." Maggie gestured to the coffee maker. "Help yourself. I need to—" Her phone rang. Her assistant, Jennifer, sounded frantic. "Maggie, you need to get down here now. Someone posted photos on social media of you with, well, they're calling her a person without housing. It's all over the business blogs this morning." Maggie's blood went cold. She glanced at Sarah, who was pouring coffee with the precise movements of someone who had learned to make small luxuries last. "What kind of photos?" Maggie asked, stepping into the bedroom for privacy. "Hotel lobby security footage looks like. You helping someone seeking shelter going up to the elevator together. The comments are, 'Maggie, this is really challenging.' And timing with the acquisition negotiations." Through the bedroom doorway, Maggie could see Sarah reading a newspaper someone had slipped under their door, her expression growing increasingly tense. "The board is asking questions," Jennifer continued. "Harrison's team is suggesting this shows poor judgment, instability. David Harrison himself called 20 minutes ago asking if you needed professional support dealing with the stress of negotiations." Maggie closed her eyes. 2 years building her reputation back up after the divorce, proving she could run the company without her ex-husband's connections, and now this. "I'll be there in an hour," she said, ending the call. "When?" She returned to the main room. Sarah was standing by the windows, the newspaper folded in her hands. "I should go," Sarah said without turning around. "Sarah, local CEO's questionable judgment," Sarah read from the paper. "Tech executive Margaret Chen's late-night encounter raises questions about leadership stability." They got my picture. In from somewhere, probably old hospital records. She finally turned, her expression carefully neutral. "I won't let my situation affect what you've built." Before Maggie could respond, her phone rang again. This time the caller ID made her stomach drop. Her ex-husband Michael. "What's going on, Maggie?" Michael's voice carried the particular blend of condescension and concern that had defined the last years of their marriage. "Emma saw the photos online. She's asking questions I don't know how to answer." Emma, their 16-year-old daughter, already struggling with the divorce and her parents' very public corporate battles. "It's not what it looks like, Michael. It looks like you helped someone without housing and spent the night with her in a hotel, in the middle of the most important business negotiations of your career. That's exactly what it looks like, because apparently that's exactly what it is." Sarah moved toward the door, gathering the few possessions she'd brought with her. "Don't," Maggie said to her, covering the phone. "Please don't go yet." "I have to," Sarah replied. "This isn't your fault, but it's not mine to fix either." Michael was still talking. "The board is going to question you intensely over this, Maggie. You know that, right? Harrison's already suggesting you're having some kind of breakdown. This plays right into their narrative that the company needs stable leadership." Maggie watched Sarah pause at the door, her hand on the handle. "I need to go," Maggie said to Michael. "We'll talk later." "Maggie, listen to me. Whatever midlife crisis or guilt complex you're working through, you need to get it together. You're about to lose everything we built." The line went quiet. In the silence that followed, Sarah opened the door. "Wait," Maggie said, crossing the room quickly. "Let me help you. I can get you a place to stay, help you find work." "With money?" Sarah asked, not unkindly. "You think you can write a check and make this disappear?" "I think I can at least try to do something meaningful with the privilege I have." Sarah studied her face for a long moment. "Is that what this is about? Meaning?" Before Maggie could answer, her phone buzzed with another text from Jennifer. "Harrison's lawyers just released a statement questioning your fitness to lead during negotiations. Board meeting in 45 minutes. They're going to ask you to step down." The weight of her collapsing professional world pressed down on Maggie's shoulders. 15 years of building something from nothing, and it could all disappear because she'd shown kindness to a stranger. "I have to go," she said to Sarah, hating how the words tasted. "But this conversation isn't over. Can you meet me later, after I deal with this corporate situation?" Sarah's expression had already closed off, the warmth of their night-long conversation. Retreating behind walls of self-protection. "Take care of yourself, Maggie," she said gently, "and thank you for last night. It meant more than you know." She left before Maggie could protest further, disappearing into the hotel's corridor like she'd never been there at all. 40 minutes later, Maggie sat in Chen Tech Solutions' glass-walled conference room, facing a board that looked at her like she'd committed corporate malpractice. "The optics are challenging," said Board Chair Patricia Vance, sliding a tablet across the table, showing social media posts about Maggie's erratic behavior. Harrison Industries is using this as evidence that you're unfit to negotiate on behalf of shareholders. They're suggesting we remove you as CEO immediately, added board member James Walsh, before you can do any more damage to the company's reputation. Maggie stared at the tablet screen, at the photos of her helping Sarah, and felt a strange disconnect from the woman in those images. Someone who had acted on impulse, on human decency, without calculating the corporate cost. What I did last night has nothing to do with my ability to run this company, she said. Doesn't it? Patricia leaned forward. You helped a random person without housing during the most critical business negotiations in our company's history. You spent the night with her in a hotel suite while Harrison's team was preparing their final offer. That suggests a level of distraction and poor judgment that frankly concerns our investors. The meeting continued for 2 hours, a corporate tribunal that dissected every decision Maggie had made in the past year, using last night's kindness as evidence of her unsuitability for leadership. By the end, she'd agreed to issue a public statement distancing herself from any personal involvement with Sarah, characterizing their encounter as a brief, charitable impulse that wouldn't affect her professional judgment. She left the building, feeling hollowed out, like she'd traded a piece of her soul for the promise of keeping her company intact. That evening, alone in her Lincoln Park penthouse, Maggie found an envelope that had been slipped under her door. Inside, Sarah's handwriting. On hotel stationery, Maggie, I wanted you to know something about the night your mother passed away. Before she slipped away, she told me about a little girl who used to build elaborate blanket forts in the living room, who would invite her in for important meetings, where they'd discuss the day's adventures over pretend tea. She said you were always trying to take care of everyone, even as a child. I think that little girl is still there, underneath all the business suits and board meetings. Don't let them convince you that kindness is weakness. Don't let them make you forget who you really are. The nurse who cared for your mother wasn't just doing her job last night. She was being human. Sometimes that's the most important thing we can do. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for making me feel visible again, even if only for one night. Sarah P.S. I left something for you in the hotel safe. Box 247. The combination is your mother's birthday. Maggie stared at the letter until the words blurred, feeling the weight of a choice that seemed to grow heavier with each passing hour. She had saved her company, preserved her professional reputation, and done exactly what the business world expected of a rational CEO. So why did it feel like she had lost something infinitely more valuable than any corporate acquisition could ever be worth? The hotel safe contained a small wooden box that Maggie recognized immediately, her mother's jewelry box, the one that had disappeared from the house after the funeral. Inside, nestled among her mother's modest collection of jewelry, was a folded piece of paper in her mother's handwriting. For Maggie, when she's old enough to understand that success without love is just expensive loneliness. Below that, an address. On Chicago's South Side, 3 days had passed since the board meeting. 3 days of watching Harrison Industries tighten their grip on her company while she played the role of the chastened CEO, making public appearances that emphasized her renewed focus on business fundamentals. The acquisition was proceeding exactly as planned, with Maggie's own board increasingly willing to accept Harrison's offer rather than risk further instability in leadership. She'd spent those 3 days thinking about Sarah's letter, about the wooden box, about her mother's final message. She'd also spent them trying to locate Sarah, making calls to shelters and walking through downtown Chicago with a purpose that felt both desperate and necessary. On Thursday evening, she found her. The address in her mother's note led to a community health clinic in a neighborhood that was clearly struggling, boarded storefronts mixed with small businesses fighting to survive, people hurrying down sidewalks with the particular wariness of those who'd learned to expect trouble. Inside the clinic, past a waiting room filled with people who couldn't afford traditional healthcare, Maggie found Sarah in a back office that had been converted into a makeshift medical supply room. She was organizing medications while talking quietly to an elderly man about his wellness management. Sarah looked up when Maggie appeared in the doorway, surprise flickering across her features before settling into something more guarded. "How did you find me?" she asked after the elderly man had shuffled away with his medications. "My mother left me an address. She volunteered here, didn't she?" Sarah nodded. 2 afternoons a week for the last 5 years of her life. She helped with intake, talked to people who were scared or confused about their treatment. She was good at making people feel heard. "Were you working here when she—" "I started volunteering here after I lost my nursing license. Your mother and I worked together for about 6 months before she got sick." Sarah resumed organizing pill bottles with precise, practiced movements. "She talked about you all the time, how proud she was, how worried." Maggie watched Sarah's hands, still steady, still sure, despite everything she'd lost. "You're providing medical support without a license." "I'm helping people who have nowhere else to go," Sarah corrected. "There's a difference." "Not legally." Sarah finally looked up, meeting Maggie's gaze directly. "Is that why you're here, to report me?" "I'm here because I can't stop thinking about what you said, about not letting them convince me that kindness is weakness." "And what have you decided?" Maggie pulled out her phone, showing Sarah the headlines from the past 3 days. Chen Tech, CEO returns focus to business fundamentals. Harrison Industries confident in acquisition timeline. Local executive puts corporate responsibilities first. "I've decided that I dislike the person I become when I choose safety over truth," Maggie said. Something in Sarah's posture softened slightly. "What does that mean?" "It means I want to help you get your nursing license back. It means I want to fund this clinic properly so you're not working with donated supplies and volunteer doctors. It means—" Maggie paused, surprised by the clarity of her own convictions. "It means I want to do something that matters more than stock prices and market share." Sarah set down the pill bottle she'd been holding. "Maggie, that's a beautiful sentiment, but you can't solve systemic problems with individual guilt." "Maybe not, but I can start somewhere." Maggie moved closer, lowering her voice. "I've been thinking about what you said, about my mother, about the little girl building blanket forts. What if that little girl grew up to build something bigger? What if instead of just protecting what I have, I used it to protect people like you?" For the first time since the hotel, Sarah smiled, not the careful, self-protective expression she'd worn at the clinic, but something genuine and warm. "That's a risky way of thinking for a CEO," she said. "Maybe I'm tired of being safe." They spent the next 2 hours walking through the clinic, Sarah explaining the gaps in care, the bureaucratic barriers that kept people from getting help, the way the system seemed designed to punish poverty rather than address it. Maggie found herself taking notes, asking questions, seeing not just problems, but potential solutions. "I could do this," she said, as they stood in the clinic's small break room, drinking coffee that tasted like it had been made sometime the previous week. "I could step back from the company, let Harrison have it, and focus on this instead." "You'd give up everything you've built?" "What have I built, really? A consulting firm that's profitable but not particularly meaningful. A reputation that apparently crumbles the moment I show basic human decency." Maggie shook her head. "Maybe it's time to build something different." Sarah studied her face with the intense attention of someone who'd learned to read people carefully. "You're serious about this? More serious than I've been about anything in years." "There's something you should know," Sarah said slowly, "about why I was really in that hotel lobby that night." Maggie waited, sensing something significant coming. I wasn't there by accident. I'd been watching the building for 3 days, working up the courage to approach you. Approach me? Why? Sarah reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a manila folder, worn at the edges from handling. Because of this, inside the folder were medical records, financial documents, and what looked like correspondence between lawyers. Maggie recognized some of the letterhead, firms that had represented her company in various matters over the years. I don't understand, Maggie said, scanning the papers. The night your mother passed away, she wasn't just talking about you. She was talking about something that had been weighing on her mind for months. Something about your company's healthcare, consulting contracts. Maggie's blood began to slow in her veins. What about them? Chen Tech Solutions provided consulting services to Midwest Regional Healthcare Network, right? Help them optimize their emergency response protocols, reduce costs? Yes, it was one of our biggest contracts. Maggie looked up from the papers. Sarah, what does this have to do with... The protocol, changes your company recommended, resulted in nursing staff reductions, including the cuts that led to the understaffing the night I made that medication. Error. The night that affected my life and cost a patient his health. The folder slipped from Maggie's hands, papers scattering across the break room floor. She stared at Sarah, understanding beginning to dawn, like a sickness in her stomach. You're saying... I'm saying that your company's recommendations directly contributed to the conditions that affected my career and harmed a patient. Your mother figured it out about 6 months before she passed away. She tried to talk to you about it, but I was always too busy, Maggie finished. Remembering her mother's increasingly frequent calls about important things she needed to discuss, calls Maggie had cut short because of meetings, negotiations, the endless demands of building her empire. She was planning to tell you everything. The night she had her heart episode, Sarah continued, her voice gentle despite the devastating revelation. She felt responsible. She said you would never have taken the contract if you'd known how it would be implemented. Maggie sank into a plastic chair, the weight of this knowledge pressing down on her like physical force. So when you approached me that night, I wasn't looking for revenge, Sarah said quickly. I was looking for answers. I wanted to understand how someone whose mother had talked about her daughter's good heart could build a company that caused so much harm without seeming to care. And what did you conclude? Sarah knelt down, gathering the scattered papers. That maybe you didn't know, that maybe the distance between corporate decisions and human consequences had gotten so wide that you couldn't see the connection anymore. Maggie felt like she was falling, like everything solid in her world was crumbling beneath her feet. Her mother's guilt, Sarah's affected life, the man who had been harmed because hospitals prioritized her company's cost-saving measures over adequate staffing. This changes everything, she whispered. Does it? Sarah asked. Or does it just make everything clearer? Before Maggie could respond, her phone rang. Jennifer, her assistant, sounding more panicked than Maggie had ever heard her. Maggie, you need to get to the office immediately. Harrison's team is here with the final acquisition papers. The board is meeting in emergency session. They're voting tonight. What's the rush? Someone leaked information about your visits to community shelters. Harrison is claiming it's evidence of continued instability. They're demanding the board vote immediately before you can do any more damage to shareholder confidence. Maggie looked at Sarah, who was listening to the one-sided conversation with growing concern. I'll be there in an hour, Maggie said. Maggie, Jennifer's voice was urgent, they're going to remove you as CEO tonight. Harrison has already drafted a press release about restoring stable leadership. You need to get here now if you want. Any chance of fighting this? The call ended. In the silence that followed, Maggie and Sarah looked at each other across the break room, both understanding that the choice that had been building for days was now crystallizing into an immediate decision. You have to go, Sarah said. Do I? Maggie asked. What if I just let them have it? What if I walk away from all of it? Then you'll spend the rest of your life wondering if you gave up too easily. Maggie stood, straightening her jacket. Come with me. What? Come with me to the board meeting. Help me tell them the truth about the Midwest regional contract. Help me explain why some things matter more than stock prices. Sarah shook her head. That's corporate career ending, Maggie. You know that, maybe. Or maybe it's the first honest thing I've done in years. Sarah studied her face, searching for something. Maybe sincerity, maybe courage, maybe just the willingness to risk everything for the possibility of redemption. Okay, she said finally. But you should know that once you open this door, you can't close it again. Once you choose truth over safety, there's no going back. Maggie picked up her purse, feeling lighter than she had in years, despite the weight of what lay ahead. Good, she said. I'm tired of going backward anyway. They left the clinic together, heading toward a confrontation that would either transform Maggie's career or redirect it into something entirely different. Behind them, the community health clinic continued its quiet work of caring for people the world had forgotten, a reminder that sometimes the most important battles were fought not in boardrooms, but in the spaces where human dignity was either honored or abandoned. The choice was finally clear. Now came the much harder work of living with the consequences. An hour later, Maggie walked into the Chen Tech Solutions boardroom with Sarah at her side, ready to tell a story that would change everything, not just for her company, but for her. Understanding of what success actually meant. The board members looked up in surprise, clearly not expecting Maggie to bring a witness to her own corporate reckoning. Before you vote, Maggie said, taking her seat at the head of the conference table, there are some things about our business practices that you need to know. Some things about the real cost of the success we've been so proud of. She looked at Sarah, who nodded encouragingly and began to speak. What followed would either be the end of her career or the beginning of something entirely different, something that her mother would have recognized as the natural evolution of a little girl who had once built blanket forts where everyone was welcome, where the most important meetings were about making sure everyone felt safe and heard. The little girl who had somehow grown up to forget that the most valuable things in life couldn't be acquired, only shared. 6 months later, Maggie sat in Rosie's diner at 5:30 in the morning, watching Chicago wake up through windows that hadn't been cleaned in decades. The vinyl booth was cracked, the coffee was stronger than it needed to be, and the fluorescent lights cast everything in a harsh glare that revealed every flaw, including her own. She looked different now. The expensive suits had been replaced by practical clothes that could survive clinic work and community meetings. Her hair was shorter, simpler, and she'd stopped wearing the watch her ex-husband had given her as a wedding gift, a chique timepiece that had once seemed like a symbol of success, but now felt like expensive handcuffs. The board meeting 6 months ago had been a professional reckoning, professionally speaking. Maggie's revelation about the Midwest regional healthcare contract had indeed been career-transforming. The board had voted unanimously to accept Harrison Industries' acquisition offer, removing Maggie as CEO effective immediately and installing interim leadership that promised stable, profitable management focused on shareholder value. Harrison Industries had paid $42 million for Chen Tech Solutions. Maggie's severance package, after legal fees and settlements related to the healthcare contract revelations, had left her with enough money to start over, but not enough to maintain the lifestyle she'd built over 15 years of corporate success. It should have felt like failure. Instead, it felt like waking up. The bell above the diner's door chimed, and Sarah slipped into the booth across from Maggie, carrying a folder thick with grant applications and community health assessments. How did the meeting with the city planners go? Maggie asked, pouring Sarah coffee from the carafe that lived permanently on their table. Better than expected, Sarah replied, opening the folder. They're interested in the integrated care model. The idea of combining medical services with job training and housing assistance in one location, they think it could be a pilot program for other underserved neighborhoods. 6 months ago, Maggie would have seen Sarah's excitement as naive idealism. Now she recognized it as the energy that came from work that mattered, from building something that addressed real problems rather than generating abstract profit. The Chen Foundation had been Maggie's answer to the question of what to do with the wreckage of her corporate life. Using her severance money and liquidating most of her personal assets, she'd established a non-profit focused on healthcare access for underserved populations, with particular attention to the gaps that left people like Sarah vulnerable to systemic failure. Sarah had become the Foundation's first full-time employee after successfully petitioning the State Nursing Board to restore her license. The process had taken months of legal work, character witnesses, and Maggie's testimony about the systemic factors that had led to Sarah's original situation. But when the reinstatement letter arrived, Sarah had cried, the first time Maggie had seen her show such unguarded emotion. "There's something else," Sarah said, sliding a newspaper across the table. Harrison Industries made the business section again. Maggie glanced at the headline. Harrison Industries under investigation for healthcare compliance issues. The article detailed how Chentech Solutions consulting recommendations, now under Harrison's ownership, had been linked to patient care concerns at multiple hospital systems. "They're facing federal scrutiny," Sarah continued. "Apparently, someone shared documents showing they knew their cost-cutting measures were compromising patient safety, but implemented them anyway to boost quarterly profits." Maggie read silently, feeling a complex mix of vindication and sadness. Her old company, the thing she'd built from nothing, was now being used in ways that contradicted the very people she'd originally wanted to help through improved efficiency and reduced healthcare costs. "Do you regret it?" Sarah asked quietly. "Walking away from all of that?" Maggie looked up from the newspaper, considering the question. 6 months ago, she'd been worth millions on paper, commanded respect in boardrooms, and wielded the kind of power that came with controlling significant resources. Now, she lived in a modest apartment in Logan Square, drove a used Honda, and spent her days in community health clinics and city planning meetings. "No," she said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "I regret how long it took me to see what actually mattered." Sarah smiled, the genuine, unguarded expression that had become more frequent as their partnership deepened. "Your mother would be proud." "I hope so." Maggie reached across the table, covering Sarah's hand with her own in a gesture that had become natural between them, not romantic but deeply connected. The touch of two people who had learned to trust each other completely. "She tried to tell me, about the healthcare contracts, about what the company was becoming. I was too busy being successful to listen." "You're listening now." Through the diner's windows, the Chicago skyline caught the morning light, including the Harrison Industries building that now housed what used to be Chentech Solutions. From this distance, it looked impressive, gleaming glass and steel, reaching toward the sky like a monument to ambition. Maggie had once thought that kind of success was what she was building toward, what would make her mother proud, what would improve her worth to the world. Now she understood that her mother's pride had never been conditional on corporate achievements or financial milestones. It had been there all along, waiting for Maggie to remember who she'd been before she learned, to measure her value in stock options and market share. "I have an idea," Maggie said, pulling out her own folder of documents. "What if we expanded the integrated care model beyond just medical services?" Sarah raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "What if we created a space that addressed all the ways people fall through the cracks? Medical care, job training, legal aid, housing assistance, mental health services, all in one place, all designed to treat people like human beings instead of problems to be managed. That would require significant funding, Sarah pointed out, but Maggie could see the interest in her eyes. I've been thinking about that. Maggie spread out financial projections and architectural sketches she'd been working on with a team of volunteers, former colleagues who'd left their corporate jobs to join her foundation. What if we converted some of the underutilized buildings in underserved neighborhoods, create community centers that were actually centered on the community's needs? Sarah studied the plans, her expression growing more animated as she understood the scope of what Maggie was proposing. "This is ambitious. This is necessary," Maggie corrected. "And it's what my mother was trying to tell me before she passed away, that success without service is just selfishness with better marketing." They spent the next hour going through the plans, discussing logistics and funding strategies, and the dozens of regulatory hurdles they'd need to navigate. It was the kind of detailed, complex work that Maggie had once done in corporate boardrooms, but now it felt different, grounded in purpose rather than profit, motivated by the desire to solve problems rather than exploit them. "There's one more new thing," Maggie said as they prepared to leave for their first meeting of the day. "I want you to be the executive director. This should be your project as much as mine." Sarah paused in gathering her papers. "Maggie, I appreciate the vote of confidence, but I've been without permanent housing for 2 years. I'm barely 6 months back into nursing. No one's going to take me seriously as the head of a major non-profit." "They took me seriously when all I had was an MBA and an inherited client list," Maggie pointed out. "Leadership isn't about credentials. It's about understanding the problems you're trying to solve and caring enough about the solutions to see them through." Sarah looked at her across the diner table, and Maggie saw in her expression the same recognition that had passed between them that first night in the hotel. Two women who had found in each other not just friendship, but a shared sense of purpose that neither had expected. "Partners?" Sarah asked, extending her hand. "Partners," Maggie agreed, shaking it. They left Rosie's diner together, walking into a Chicago morning that held the promise of another day spent building something meaningful. Behind them, the diner's neon sign flickered against the dawn light, a small beacon in a city full of people trying to find their way home. As they walked toward the community health clinic, where they'd spend the morning working with people who had been forgotten by more successful, more efficient systems, Maggie felt her phone buzz with a text message. Her daughter Emma, now 17 and increasingly interested in her mother's new work. "Mom, my social justice class is doing a project on systemic inequality. Can I interview you about the foundation for my presentation?" Maggie smiled, typing back, "Of course, but you should interview Sarah too. She's the one who taught me that the most important questions aren't about how much you can accumulate, but about how much you can contribute." 6 months ago, that text would have embarrassed her, a reminder of how far she'd fallen from corporate respectability. Now it felt like evidence of something far more valuable, the possibility that her daughter might grow up understanding that true success was measured not in quarterly earnings, but in the number of people whose lives were made better by your presence in the world. The foundation had 3 more meetings scheduled that day, with city planners, potential donors, and a group of community leaders who wanted to understand how Maggie's vision might serve their neighborhoods. It was the kind of packed schedule that had once exhausted her, but now energized her with the knowledge that each conversation brought them closer to creating something that would outlast any corporate acquisition or stock price fluctuation. As they reached the clinic, Sarah paused at the entrance, looking back toward the skyline where Harrison Industries building stood as a monument to the kind of success Maggie had once pursued. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd chosen differently that night?" Sarah asked. "If you'd let security escort me from the hotel lobby?" Maggie considered the question, thinking about the path not taken, the corporate victory that would have preserved her wealth and status but left her fundamentally unchanged, fundamentally alone. "I think about it sometimes," she admitted. "But then I remember something my mother used to say when I was building those blanket forts as a kid." "What was that?" "She'd say, 'The most important room in any house is the one where everyone feels welcome.' I spent 15 years building a very impressive house, but I forgot to leave room for anyone else." Sarah's hand briefly touched Maggie's shoulder, a gesture of understanding and shared purpose that felt more valuable than any corporate bonus or stock option Maggie had ever received. "Well," Sarah said, opening the clinic door, "I'd say you're making up for lost time." Inside the clinic, the day's first patients were already waiting, people who had been failed by systems designed to help them, who had learned to expect disappointment from institutions that promised care but delivered bureaucracy instead. But in the small examination rooms and crowded waiting areas, Maggie and Sarah had begun to prove that a different approach was possible. It wasn't easy work, and it wasn't always successful. Some days ended in frustration, in the recognition that individual efforts, no matter how sincere, could only address a fraction of the systemic problems they'd identified. But other days, like today, held the possibility that meaningful change was not just idealistic dreaming, but achievable reality. As the morning progressed, Maggie found herself thinking about her mother's jewelry box, about the note that had waited years to deliver its message about expensive loneliness. She thought about Sarah's courage in approaching her that night, about the choice that had seemed so impulsive at the time, but now felt like the most carefully considered decision of her life. Most of all, she thought about the little girl who had built blanket forts where everyone was welcome, where the most important meetings were about making sure everyone felt safe and heard. That little girl hadn't disappeared during 15 years of corporate success. She had just been waiting for the right moment to remind her older self that the best rooms in any house, real or metaphorical, were the ones designed not for impressing visitors, but for sheltering people who needed a place to belong. By midday, the foundation had received preliminary approval for their first integrated care center, secured a matching grant from an unexpected donor, and welcomed 2 new volunteer coordinators who brought expertise in areas where Maggie and Sarah were still learning. It felt like progress. More importantly, it felt like home, not the expensive, isolated home that Maggie had built with corporate success, but the kind of home her mother had tried to teach her about, where success was measured not in what you could accumulate, but in what you could share. That evening, as they prepared to leave the clinic, Sarah turned to Maggie with a question that had been building for months. "Do you think we're actually making a difference?" she asked. "Or are we just making ourselves feel better about problems that are too big for us to solve?" Maggie looked around the clinic, at the examination rooms where people received care they couldn't afford elsewhere, at the waiting area where children did homework while their parents received treatment, at the bulletin board covered with job, training announcements and housing resources, and the 100 small ways a community tried to take care of itself. "I think," she said finally, "that the question isn't whether we're solving all the problems. The question is whether we're solving them better than we did before, and whether we're creating space for other people to solve them too." Sarah nodded, gathering her jacket and the folders that never seemed to get smaller, no matter how many meetings they attended or grants they submitted. "Your mother was right, you know," she said as they prepared to leave, "about expensive loneliness. I spent 2 years on the streets learning that being alone with nothing feels exactly the same as being alone with everything. The only difference is the thread count of the sheets you rest on." They walked out of the clinic together into a Chicago evening that held the promise of another day's work towards something that mattered. Behind them, the lights stayed on in the examination rooms, where volunteer doctors would continue seeing. Patience long after the official hours ended, where the work of caring for people would continue regardless of profit margins or efficiency metrics. It wasn't the kind of success that made headlines or impressed former colleagues. But it was the kind of success that let Maggie sleep peacefully, knowing that the little girl who had once built blanket forts for everyone who needed shelter had finally grown up to build something worthy of her mother's pride. The choice had been made months ago in a hotel lobby during a blizzard, but every day, in small acts of service and moments of genuine connection, Maggie and Sarah continued to choose, again and again, the kind of success that could only be measured in the space between people, in the willingness to see strangers as neighbors, in the recognition that the most expensive thing anyone could afford was the luxury of not caring about anyone else. As they disappeared into the Chicago evening, the clinic's lights continued to shine through the darkness, a small beacon of hope in a city that was learning, one person at a time, that the most important victories were won not in boardrooms, but in the quiet moments when people chose to see each other's humanity despite every reason to look away. The CEO and the woman seeking shelter had become partners in something far more valuable than any corporate merger: the daily work of proving that kindness, properly applied, could indeed change the world. Thank you for listening to this story until the end. If you enjoyed it, please support the channel, subscribe, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments so you don't miss the next episodes. See you in the next story.